Hey everyone, Jack here. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new to the channel, I cover a variety of topics as they relate to real estate, investing, the markets, and everything as it relates to personal finance. So if you like that sort of content, be sure to have a look around the channel. And if you like what you see, be sure to subscribe. Now, I actually wasn't planning on doing a video today, but I came across this story that I definitely wanted to share with you guys if you haven't seen it already. But it's actually related to the story that I talked about a few weeks ago when Simon Property Group, the giant mall REIT, sued Gap, one of its tenants in many of its properties, since Gap refused to pay rent through this whole crisis since they were forced to shut down, and obviously revenues are down across the board for traditional retail. I'll go ahead and put a link to that video on the screen right now if you want to get up to date with that. But otherwise, we have a new update to that story, and that's that Gap is actually suing its landlords rather than vice versa, since it has a number of suits right now, not just with Simon Property, but with other landlords that have sued it for back rent. Now, Gap is actually claiming that it doesn't have to pay rent, and that's because they're trying to say that basically their obligation to pay rent ended because of all the shutdowns and governments forcing it to close. So in those states where that happened, which Gap is all over the country, they decided to sue their landlord, saying that we don't have to pay rent, and the fact that you're forcing us to pay rent is a breach of contract. So I actually found the Cook County complaint. So the main defendant here is actually Brookfield Properties, which is a large REIT, and it looks like these are all the holding companies that have leases with Gap, but are otherwise owned by Brookfield Properties. So Gap's suing all of them just to cover their bases, but really it's targeted at Brookfield Properties, and this is a Cook County-based suit in Illinois. Let's take a look at the complaint itself and actually what Gap is saying is the problem and why they think that they're entitled to the remedy that they're seeking. So specifically, Gap explains this whole thing that obviously that we had a pandemic, it's really bad, and it was unforeseeable, unimaginable, terrible. Yes, so that's pretty much agreed upon that the pandemic was not an expected event, and it led to all sorts of problems, and it made it very hard for retailers like Gap to actually do business. And because of that, it made it harder to pay rent. I don't think that's a dispute anywhere. However, Gap says that because of the government restrictions, it actually doesn't owe anything to their landlords since this pandemic started, and that they're entitled to have their leases reformed, and that they're also entitled to attorney's fees and expenses in connection with this action. So Gap wants to have its rent waived, essentially, saying that they are not legally obligated to pay that rent, even though they signed a lease saying that they'd pay rent for retail purposes. And that's the basis of this lawsuit. I'll actually go down to some of the reasoning we have here, and it explains that the purpose of the lease, the express purpose of the lease, was to provide them with commercial retail space suitable for the operation of retail stores selling apparel. Okay, if I haven't seen the actual lease itself, but I assume it says something like that Gap, the tenant, is in the business of selling apparel, and we're using the space for that. That's the purpose of this lease, so that makes sense. Now, the argument that Gap is making is that because of the government restrictions and the pandemic, that this purpose was frustrated. Frustration of purpose is the actual legal term, and that is a very high bar to meet. Typically, it's reserved for something more extreme, or maybe as extreme, depending on how the court views this, but where two parties want to do something with getting work done. Maybe a contractor is hired to do some sort of construction on a site, but then the city passes some law saying that this type of construction is no longer allowed. Well, all of a sudden, the purpose of that contract is frustrated, so both parties would just walk away free and clear without having to do anything. It's a very simple example. There's a lot of factors that go into it, but that's kind of the general premise. Now, Gap's extending that premise here, saying that because this express purpose, was frustrated when a government said that you could not open your stores, therefore, the landlord was no longer providing a commercial retail space suitable for the operation of retail stores selling apparel. They said that this purpose was frustrated by the shutdown and by the government laws saying that they couldn't have their store open, or at least open in the same way as before, which would hurt demand and everything. So you can see it here. Following the outbreak, the tenants were forced to suspend all retail operations on the premises. And they also said that they decided to close all their stores on March 19th, I guess voluntarily, but a lot of this was due to the state regulation. This makes sense that they're trying to argue that they were all retail operations had to be suspended and they couldn't do anything. Now, all of these were unforeseeable, says GAAP, and this was not the fault of either party. And because of that, the premises were frustrated and it became impossible to actually carry out the purpose of the lease, so GAAP argues. But the problem is that landlords have wrongfully demanded that tenants pay rent for the period of time that tenants were forced to close. They're saying that because the frustration of purpose was valid there, they shouldn't have to pay rent for it. And obviously, landlords on the other side have been looking for rent since they need that rental income as well. And if you have a bunch of tenants who are withholding rent, that's a problem for the greater system. So you see where there's a clear conflict here. Now, this is a decently compelling argument by GAAP. They go on to finish the complaint saying that because of the frustration of purpose and the fact that landlords were asking for rent, that this constituted breach of contract, and also unjust enrichment because the landlord was trying to get money out of a tenant that wasn't obligated to pay, is basically the premise of this complaint. I won't go through the rest of it, but that's kind of it. So this is a big deal and something to definitely keep an eye on, because if any of the states say that, yes, GAAP, you did not actually have to pay rent during this time, that is going to be very, very expensive for landlords throughout the country. Because guess what? You're going to have a lot of tenants come knocking saying, hey, GAAP here just got their judgment saying that they didn't have to pay rent. We want a refund. We want our rent waived as well, or they're going to want the same remedy that GAAP gets here, no doubt, if this goes in GAP's favor. So definitely worth keeping an eye on. I'm not sure if they're going to be able to do it, since this is a tough bar, frustration of purpose. But it is decently compelling, since this is a very unusual circumstance. It's really going to come down to whether or not a court thinks that the purpose of that lease is that narrow, and that the purpose of the lease is specifically for selling retail apparel, and that the space was intended to only be used for that purpose, which is a little bit tough to do. Because remember that these leases are often 15 years in length, or at least over a decade in many cases. Big box store tenants typically have very long leases. And is it reasonable to say that the same purpose is going to be used for that entire 15-year period? The economy is always changing, and economic difficulties do not justify a frustration of purpose claim, at least in history. So we'll see if courts look into that a little more liberally and change the meaning of frustration of purpose, or make it a lot easier to achieve. I'm not sure if they're going to do that, but definitely something to keep an eye on, because you never know what a court's going to do. They are supposed to follow precedent, but they can set their own precedent if they think that the times have changed and it's justified in some other way, or if some statute says that it's fine. But again, if GAAP gets its judgment and doesn't have to pay rent, this is a big deal, because a lot of other tenants are going to want that same remedy, and landlords are going to be footing the bill here. That's really what this whole conflict is all about. You have the government, which shut down all of these stores. The stores then took losses, and now it's trying to figure out who actually bears the loss here. Do the retail tenants bear the lost rent, or do the landlords pay the lost rent? Or does the government have to foot the bill? We'll see what happens. But right now, it's trying to decide who actually has to pay rent right now. Do tenants get off the hook, or do landlords get off the hook and just carry on as normal? Anyways, that's all I've got for today. If you like this video, please like it, since it helps the channel out a lot. I cover a variety of topics, like I said, as they relate to real estate, the markets, and I'll definitely be covering this whole issue with tenants versus landlords and who has to pay rent on the retail side, since this has much broader economic implications, and also for commercial real estate as a whole. So if you like that sort of content, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any new updates. And also take a look in the description below for free stocks with Webull and Robinhood, and also check out my favorite stock brokerage, M1 Finance. If you open up accounts with those guys, I'll potentially get an affiliate commission, but definitely check them out, since you can get some free stuff out of them, and there's some cool features on all of those platforms. But until next time, take care.